Oh, hello again, and welcome to week 2 of Mobility, Culture and Communication. So, this week we're looking at the topic of global people movements and the contemporary nation. And I'd like to begin by saying that I live and work on the Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and that the nation that we call Australia is a construct that often diminishes the rights of the original custodians of this land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and highlight that sovereignty was never ceded. I recognise that some of the ideas and language that we use in this lecture are contested, and I hope that you approach these perspectives with a critical lens. So my rough guideline for this lecture is to introduce you to ideas of how people moved historically and how they move today, and to connect these to the theories of mobility which we learnt last week. I will also expand on some theories of migration, namely microagentic, macrostructuralist, and also complexity theories. We'll then move into thinking about metaphors of the nation state and the role of media in the formation of the nation state. The final part of this lecture will focus on thinking critically about how mobility is seen as a threat but also as an opportunity. And we will do this by considering both the concept of diaspora and the current situation of refugees globally. So let's get into the slides. So how have people moved historically? The traditional image of migration is still derived from the 19th century. It was a period in which transportation systems were pretty crude, risky, and expensive. And this is what we call the first classic epoch period of migration, and we tend to think of it as a one-way journey. That is, people generally moved on a permanent basis. Often the men went in advance, families followed, and so on and so forth. In this kind of migration, there was a clear link between people from one region and the place of settlement. The conventional metaphor and model that was used to explain this link is the chain, in the sense that migrants wrote letters back home that inspired friends and relatives to follow them, and this progression of people from one part of the world made a chain that linked the two places together. We can consider this today when we think of something like the large Greek diaspora in Melbourne, which has the largest population of people from Athens outside of Athens. Now, this is a rather benign image of migration as settlement, and it placed a great deal of emphasis on the pioneering spirit of the migrant, and their movement was generally described as being driven by individual choice. In this model of motion, the place of origin and the place of destination mark the two pillars in a linear story of transformation. It is motion that is the period in between the two settled states. Motion is a temporary disruption from one state, and it is overcome by arriving in another. Arrival is then the re-establishment of identity and culture. A more insidious story that is central to the classical period of migration is forced movement in the transatlantic triangle. A typical journey connects the industrial centres of England, the slave ports in West Africa, and the plantation centres in North America. You can imagine a ship leaving the port of Liverpool, which back then actually had 80% of the world's manufactured goods leaving from that city. It would leave this port and then pick up slaves in West Africa, transporting them across the Atlantic, picking cotton from the American plantations that the slaved worked on, then taking this raw product to Liverpool, where it was sent to the new industrial factories near Manchester and then re-exported as garments to the rest of the world. In this triangle, the circulation of goods and people appeared linear. It was a triangle that moved in straight lines. We could also explain the trajectory of this process of mobility and migration in terms of the centre and periphery model that was used to underpin both the colonial and industrial models of economic growth and political power. As I briefly mentioned last week, the centre was considered to be Europe. This is where trade was initiated and financed, raw goods were processed and then exported, and the peripheries were the colonies of Africa, the Americas, and to a smaller extent Australia, which is where slaves and convicts were sent and from which the raw products were extracted. While the early chain migration stressed individual choice, this period is more defined by coercive and violent transportation. This defines the socio-economic forces as the prime causes of motion. From the end of World War II, so after 1945, economic opportunity was seen to be the key driving force of migration. By the 1970s, the linear pathways that you had to take from centre to periphery became a little more complex. The movement started to become a bit more multi-directional and fragmented, but still during this time, the overall presumption was that migration was a one-way trip. It was a long way to get from Western Europe to North America or South America, let alone Australia, and as most people moved by ship, which took at least a week to 3 to 4 weeks in some cases, it was very unlikely that they would make the journey back. The cost was very prohibitive, and people tended to stay for long periods of time, if not making a permanent move and resettling in that place of arrival. So far, what we have outlined connects to two key theories of migration, macrostructural and microagentic. The macrostructural theory is most often linked to a Marxist perspective, which holds that migrants are exploited as labour reserves, to be pushed and pulled from and towards different territories based on market supply and demand. The general idea is that when there is a gap in the nation's labour force, migrants will fill it, and once they have done their job, they are forced out. The microagentic theory, on the other hand, is linked to the voluntarist model of migration. Chain migration is an example of this. Microagentic theories hold that it is individuals that choose economic opportunity and migration. But, as is pointed out in your first reading of this week by Papastagiadis, neither of these overarching theories serves to explain contemporary migration. Papastagiadis sees the macrostructural as over-exaggerating power structures, and he sees the microagentic as oversimplifying migrant agency. By the time we hit the end of the 70s, start of the 1980s, things start to shift into increasingly complex forms of migration, both in terms of structural aspects, such as migratory policies, and agentic aspects, such as reasons for migrating from one place to another. For example, while in 1976, only a small number of countries were trying to lower immigration, by 2001, half the world's developed countries were implementing more restrictive measures. Another example, in 1987, we saw the first year that more flights went across the Pacific than the Atlantic, rather than the norm of the transatlantic flight from Europe to North America. By the 1990s, it was common to see specific visas developed. This is what we can deem a managerial approach to migration, which served to restrict rights for migrants deemed less desirable by nation states, while simultaneously attracting highly skilled migrants. An example here would be something like the Australian 482 visa. In a globalizing world, the origins and destinations of movement are multipolar, and the forces that drive the patterns of movement are not so clear-cut. In other words, we can no longer see any clear or singular kind of model that defines the migration movements around the world. It's no longer centre to periphery. It's no longer even focusing on one region or another. The industrialization model and migration patterns are no longer working entirely in sync with each other. There are multiple factors that are pushing and pulling people, attracting and repulsing people around the world. We also can no longer group migrants as passive to external forces, or as deviants threatening the body or mechanics of social order. It's here that we turn to complexity theory. As Professor Nikos Papastagiadis states, according to complexity theory, difference is not a problem that is in need of either segregation or integration. Difference does not threaten identity, and mobility does not exhaust energy. And yet, when we look at mainstream discourse, we continue to see a rhetoric of integration, segregation, and also mobility as a threat. To unpack why this is the case, I want to turn our focus to some metaphors of nation, namely the nation as a political body and the nation as a social machine. It's really during the Roman Empire that we began to see the metaphor of nation as body emerge. From around 48 BC, as the Roman Empire began to spread even further out from its centre in Italy, its governing body offered something unprecedented. It offered citizenship status to people born and living in the provinces and outposts of places the Romans had colonised, particularly to those who had joined their military. Here, we had the emergence of a nation that was not united geographically, so citizenship was given in order to unite people through shared allegiance and the offer of protection by the Roman Empire. As I said, this is when we see the metaphor of nation as body. It was about a head that commands, the limbs as military arms, and organs that serve specific functions to keep the body of the nation-state running cohesively. Think of how we hear problematic statements like, "The spread of Islam infects the minds of Australians." These kinds of virus-like analogies keep this metaphor of the nation as a bounded body alive today. They imply that in order to have a healthy national body, foreign objects have to be kept out. Our other main metaphor is the nation as a social machine. This one comes after the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th and early 20th century. Society as machine meant that everyone needed to play their part in order to keep the social functioning like a well-oiled engine. We can see how this aligns with the macrostructural theory of migration. At times, parts of the machine needed replacing, and migrants would fill that role, but only if they could operate cohesively as a cog within the wider mechanism. On the other hand, that which compromised that internal equilibrium of society was no longer considered a part of society, as the engine filtered out impurities and created mechanisms to fortify against external shocks. This kind of metaphor is still manifest in contemporary society, particularly as we have moved into globalization. Globalization has seen the standardization of certain products and procedures in order to make parts of the machine connect more easily for the betterment of capitalism. You can think of this like adapter plugs for society. Ultimately, these metaphors are ways in which the abstract constructs of nation could be visualized. Another key thing that shifts our perception of the nation as abstract into a sense of the nation as concrete reality has of course been media. Media such as newspapers, photography and cinema were a pivotal strategy in managing empire through the second half of the 19th century, by offering news and connections between geographically distant places. Media theorist Marshall McLuhan went as far as stating that the proliferation of newspaper culture in the 19th century was the architect of nationalism. Benedict Anderson made direct links between his famous concept of the imagined nation and print capitalism, seeing the latter as solidifying the former through the creation of large-scale zones of communication and exchange. Well-known academic Jürgen Habermas forged his career by looking at the role of media in the transition to proto-democratic systems of political authority. I know that we're all familiar with Habermas's theories around the public sphere, which is something that we will return to explore in week 4, so I'm not going to spend any time on it now. In the 1960s, McLuhan made the bold but prescient claim that electronic media would lead to the formation of a global village. In 1962, the launch of geostationary satellites meant that radio could be broadcast live around the world, beyond the physical bounds of the nation-state. But this technical capacity for transnational broadcast was limited by the national control retained over radio and television outlets. When we consider something like television, we can see how unified national programming through the second half of the 20th century enacted Anderson's idea of imagined community. Nowadays, however, we are talking about media platforms operating with global reach. Of course, we need to be conscious of the fact that global reach does not equate to global access. Almost 4.57 billion people were active internet users as of July 2020, but this is encompassing only 59% of the global population. Then, when we consider variances in digital literacy, we can further reinforce this idea that reach does not equate with access. However, if you are a person on the move, media plays a crucial role in your ability to garner information about both home and host territories. I have quite a long quote here from Scott McQuire, which I'm going to read out in full because I think it summarizes this shift really perfectly, and the way in which this shift relates to media. Now, McQuire writes that digital platforms play an important role in servicing the needs of diasporic communities as well as many other dispersed communities of interest. These audiences, considered too small to interest national broadcasters, once relied on the physical exchange of media such as tapes and DVDs, but this changed with the establishment of specialist cable and satellite channels in the 1990s and thousands, followed by the proliferation of communication networks that reach across national borders using internet telephony, video conferencing, blogs, and social networking websites. The increased availability of such circuits consolidates new modes of cultural belonging, in which place of residence is no longer the threshold condition for participation in one's home culture. End quote. Obviously, we have access to news media over the internet, but we also utilise social media platforms to speak with friends and family who are physically distant, and will often gain information about events, personal news and local or national news in this way. We no longer have to sacrifice our connections to the nation-state we were born in. We can occupy a dual space within both host and home. But what does this do to the construct of the nation-state? Remember, the construct of nation is based on the premise of shared identity and unified citizenry. So, if we have a large percentage of the population who do not pledge complete fealty to this construct, who retain connections to several territories at once, it poses a challenge to the nation. We can then ask, how is this challenge interpreted? Well, the answer is, it's interpreted in a largely contradictory way. In Australia and in most parts of the world these days, a politician must be rigid and fierce on border security, but open-minded and appreciative about multiculturalism. We celebrate cultural diversity within Australia, while taking pride that we have stopped the boats at our borders. The media is routinely reporting on the threats, problems, and harm associated with mass migration and the expulsion of refugees from their homelands. There is so much fear in the way that the world is changing. There is the fear that we will be overtaken by others, drowned in the excess of things, and unable to keep pace with the rate of innovation. On the other hand, when we hear about mobility, we also think about progress and someone moving up in the world. Governments have policies that encourage the movement of some people and goods, while restricting and excluding others. Students should travel to widen the horizons and see how things are doing in different places. However, foreign workers should not come here to steal our jobs and draw benefits from the welfare state. If we follow the dominant media portrayal of migration in Australia, it is almost all about immigration. Discussion on immigration is not just a challenge for cohesiveness of the national culture and economic prosperity, but it has infiltrated almost every dimension of federal politics. Debate now rages across a wide variety of fronts, whether immigration and infrastructure, immigration and gangs, immigration and refugees, immigration and surrendering our sovereignty. From this perspective, the phenomena is linear and the impact is one-sided. There is the sense that migrants are coming to Australia and they are dangerous, disruptive, expensive, and a threat to the unity of our national culture. In terms of media space, the migration story dominates all other cultural and political debates in Australia. While we need to bear in mind that the mediascape does not determine all other dimensions of everyday life, it is important to note how it shapes values, which in turn justify the vast resources that are expended to deal with the, in inverted commas, migration problem. According to the Australian government, however, at any given time, there are approximately 1 million Australians living overseas. Now, what does this Australian diaspora look like? The Australian diaspora has been characterised by population researchers as relatively young, highly skilled, and highly educated. They have also been cited as increasingly mobile, moving between Australia and other countries as career and life chances appear. The total permanent departures occurring in the greatest number for Australians is in the 25 to 39 age bracket. The gender distribution is almost even, with an increasing departure rate for females in their 20s and 30s. Now, according to the OECD, over 2/3 of expatriate Australians are professionals, paraprofessional managers, or in administrative occupations. They conclude that the emigration of Australian-born residents is likely to continue as a result of the increasing ease of travel, internationalisation of labour markets, and global demand for skilled workers. But I suppose we'll have to wait and see what happens with the pandemic to see if that comes to fruition. Nonetheless, an examination of the 2010 to 2011 passenger cards leaving Australia suggests that over 60% of people departing permanently were employed prior to leaving Australia. Now, according to UniMelb's anthropologist Paul Green, we're now seeing growing numbers of what is termed digital nomads, or location-independent professionals. They're working from laptops in a range of destinations, and they're typically aged in their 20s or 30s. So the biggest migrant issue in Australia, in my view, is in fact the number of people leaving Australia, the number of highly educated people giving the best years of their productive life to other locations. That is a genuine issue, and if you were a member of the government in this country, I'd hope that you would be genuinely concerned as to why your most talented, or the people that you've invested the most in, your most gifted people, are in fact providing services in countries outside of this country, are paying taxes in other countries outside of this country. However, what does the media cover? And why is there this fearful obsession over migrants and refugees? Let's have a bit of a reality check. In the year to 30th of June 2018, 526,000 people arrived to live in Australia, while 289,000 people left Australia to live overseas. Of those migrant arrivals, 62% were temporary visa holders, including 30% who were international students. There were also 30,000 New Zealand citizens who moved to Australia to live. However, in the same year, 23,000 New Zealanders also left Australia to live overseas. In addition, there were 77,000 Australian citizens who returned to Australia after living overseas, but in the same year, there were nearly 91,000 who decided to emigrate. I've put my maths up on screen so you can follow, and keep in mind that this is just me running some quick numbers, so please take this as a soft example rather than hard evidence. But if we look at this, we've got 62% of 526,000 is 326,120. 526,000 minus 326,120 equals just under 200,000. And this means that we had 89,120 more Australians emigrating to live overseas than we did migrants coming to live permanently in Australia. So even if we take away those who are living overseas temporarily, we still have 12,120 more Australians overseas than we do migrants coming in for the year 2017 to 2018. So there's this huge contradiction here, which is that people are free to go, but they're not free to come. Now, I can't help but ask, are these people opportunists seeking the best lifestyle choices they can gain for themselves? Or are they bridge builders that help Australia become more competitive in a globalising world? This tendency to focus on immigration rather than people leaving the country is not limited to Australia. Let's have a look at these slides. This first one shows you how people's perceptions about migrant populations have been warped and are drastically inflated. The second shows you how problematic stereotypes around migrants, in this case, that they are unemployed and non-contributing, have remained in people's imagination. Let's quickly link this to your second reading of this week, which had 5 assumptions of movement that were discredited, and it talked a lot about the stereotypes of migrants and refugees. So these 5 things that were discredited. The first was that international migration is something new. We've already seen that this isn't the case with the maps that I showed earlier. The second is that international movers are poor and fleeing mobility. We already know that this isn't true, even if we are just taking the Australian diaspora as an example. The third is that international migrants take away jobs and opportunities for citizens. Historically, again, no, as we saw from that Marxist supply and demand model, oftentimes nations are relying on migrants in order to build up countries. The fourth is that migrants will come and never leave. Today, this just simply isn't true. Our journeys as people on the move are multi-directional. We're often moving from one place to another, returning to home and host, making new homes in various different places around the world. And the fifth is that international migration is best countered by developing support in the nations that the migrants originate from. And, this one's up a bit more for debate, but again, not necessarily true. So where do these stereotypes and perceptions come from? Well, the rhetoric in the media is often generated by self-serving pundits and politicians. But we also have challenges to these stereotypes from some mainstream media outlets, as well as from scholars and NGOs, who present a more comprehensive examination of facts and also adopt humanitarian perspectives. And this is a really worthy endeavour. Unfortunately, it appears that in the current political landscape, this is having less and less impact. Emotional arguments, hysterical claims, wild stereotypes are fueling debates that are driven by fear and destined to generalize a condition of anxiety and insecurity. There is little to suggest that reasoned assessments and deliberative procedures are shaping public attitudes and policy frameworks. The Australian government spends over $5 billion annually to keep border control running, and this kind of spending was already in place prior to the pandemic. Over half of that was to run refugee detention centres both on and offshore, a huge irony when you consider the argument that allowing refugees to resettle in Australia would weigh too heavily on taxpayer dollars. More recently, the Morrison government announced a further spending of $270 billion over the next decade on military, and this was to, in Morrison's words, prepare for a post-COVID-19 world that is poorer, more dangerous, and more disorderly. In an interview last month, or the month before, on Channel 7, he said that we have to be prepared and ready to frame the world in which we live as best we can and be prepared to respond and play our role to protect Australia, defend Australia. We can see how, in this statement, Morrison reinforces the boundedness of the nation-state. This is a time-old political tradition based on the idea that the legitimacy of the nation-state can be enhanced if it is positioned against an other, preferably an other that can be villainized. Creating a perception of a common enemy is a fear-based tactic seen as something that will bind citizens together. And sadly, it has quite a lot of success. People are less likely to venture into the unknown, take risks, and make efforts to learn about something or someone that they do not know or understand if they are encumbered by fear or living with a sense of insecurity. Meanwhile, in America, we have had Trump's travel ban from Muslim-majority countries, thankfully overruled, but not without causing considerable damage. In Britain, we saw Brexit run with a strong anti-immigration campaign, causing a drawn-out fiasco with huge generational discrepancies between young people voting to stay and older generations voting to leave. In Poland and Hungary, we have huge shifts towards right-wing nationalism, with neo-Nazi political parties gaining ground. It appears that while globalization is transforming commerce and governments want a slice of the capitalist pie, that this has not been matched by any kind of sustainable sense of moral global connectedness. This brings us to one of the biggest events in our lifetime. In 2015, the EU declared a refugee crisis after it became the most dangerous destination for irregular migrants, with 70% of deaths occurring in the Mediterranean crossing in 2015. The parallel narrative to the refugee crisis is the war on refugees. There's been an increase of 8.7 million displaced people in 2019, totaling 79.5 million worldwide, yet another record. The EU, USA, and even smaller countries like Australia and Canada that take pride in their humanitarian record are also responsible for policies that lead to the deaths of countless refugees. How is it possible for so many people to ignore the destitution, dismiss the risks, rebuff legal obligations, perpetuate harm to refugees, as they also ignore all cost-benefit analysis in the pursuit of buildings and detention centres, investing in infrastructure and personnel that will supposedly ensure security? Once mobility is constructed as a problem, then the solution follows. A new walled order, policies, agencies, and contraptions that are installed and serve as walls, detectors, filters, deflectors, and ultimately as expellents. The tendency of building walls to block or deflate the flows of migrants has increased. There are now over 65 walls separating nations, with over 50 of them having been constructed since 9/11 in 2001. To say that there is a war on refugees in Europe, an invasion complex in Australia, and a general sense of kinetophobia may sound extreme or even hysterical. And yet, here we are. There was a time for Australia when its openness was celebrated in terms of its acceptance of post-war immigrants and its innovative policies on multiculturalism. However, with the dawn of the 21st century, Australia has become better known for its pioneering role in the brutalisation of refugees. It subordinated the principles of hospitality and the laws of asylum to the perception that security and sovereignty was potentially at risk. With the development of a strategy known as the Pacific Solution, Australia has shown the world a militarised system of refugee deterrence. It starts with a triage method of offshore interception and screening, and results in the suspension of the refugee in limbo, or their relocation to a third country. Europe, in particular, has learnt a great deal from the Australian example. This can be seen in the way it has managed its hotspots of mobility. For instance, Lampedusa in Italy is a primary hotspot for people attempting to reach Europe from Africa. Syrian asylum seekers often attempt to reach Europe through Turkey and then Lesbos and Chios in Greece. These hotspots, among others, are sites of abuse and violence. America has also learnt a great deal. In 2017, transcripts of Trump's first phone call with Malcolm Turnbull, who was then Prime Minister of Australia, showed Trump congratulating the Australian approach to refugees with the horrifying statement, "You are worse than I am." Now, I think we all know that there has been some pretty shocking reporting on refugees, terming them boat people and other derogatory names. I want to take a different approach to include thinking about the representation of refugees in media that is more well-intentioned, but also not without flaws. So in March 2016, Amnesty International called for responsibility sharing in the refugee crisis. But what is the collective imagination around responsibility and the refugee crisis that the media has presented to us? There's a research project from 2017 that looks at the representation of refugees in the media, and they found some very interesting patterns that I'd like to share with you now. So they did a typology of visibilities and found 5 different typologies. The first typology of visibility is this idea of the refugee as just biological life. So we often see this when we see images of undifferentiated masses in fragile dinghies and refugee camps who have nothing and are therefore debased to the needs of their body. The second is the visibility of empathy, which is most often associated with charitable action. So you have these images of a crying baby, kind of rhetoric around the failure of authorities to help. So one of the most famous examples of this is the image of Alan Kurdi, the Syrian boy in 2015 who drowned off the coast of Turkey. So often this typology of empathy creates an infantilization of refugees, and this research project really critiques this idea of victimhood. The third typology of visibility is, of course, the visibility of threat, which is the refugee as associated with state security. Things like this really peak after events like the Paris attacks. They ultimately stem from 9/11, and this is a critique of refugees that sees them as evildoing. And these three are the basis of 2 main tropes, which is the victim and the evildoer. And both of these are extremely problematic. The first affords the individual no agency, and the other gives them agency, but implies that they only act with malevolence. Let's move on now to the fourth typology of visibility, which is hospitality. And this is most often associated with political activism. So images of pro-refugee protests, images from the Willkommenkultur in Germany. And this often reverses the threat visibility and positions us as the threat. However, it still largely marginalizes refugees. And the final visibility typology is self-reflexivity. So this is when we start to get articles that represent refugees as people like us. However, refugees are still spoken about rather than speaking within these articles and visual representations. So the main finding of this project is that regardless of which typology of visibility that refugees are being represented within, the media is ultimately failing to adequately humanize refugees. This creates a discrepancy between the representation of refugees and their lived experience, but it is one that in recent years has started to be challenged. And I'm thinking here of something like Behrouz Boochani's incredible book, No Friend But the Mountains. If you haven't read this book, I thoroughly recommend it. Boochani is an Iranian journalist who fled Iran as a refugee and ended up spending well over a decade detained in an Australian-run offshore detention centre on Manus Island. He wrote his book in fragments via WhatsApp, sent to a Farsi translator. He has been a key figure in championing the rights of refugees and also in redressing the problematic representations of visibility that refugees face in media. Shifting away now from media representations and returning to the wider topic of global people movement and the contemporary nation, I want us to think about the concept of borders. As we have established, mobility is laced with complexity, both in terms of the reasons people have for being on the move, but also the trajectories they take. I mentioned that there has been a rise in the amount of border walls being built and fortified between territories. While I have not painted a particularly hopeful picture for you throughout this lecture, what we are ultimately seeing is a response to a decline in the power of the traditional imagined nation. The institutions and professions holding up the authority of the nation-state are in a tug-of-war with increased mobility. On the one hand, they can see the benefits. On the other, it challenges their legitimacy. We see this tug-of-war play out in how various people are mapping and monitoring the flow of people, particularly across borders. First of all, who wants a map of migration flows? The obvious answer is governments and various intelligence agencies. Borders are a huge component of the connection between nation and place and control over both. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that this kind of surveillance of movement has only been heightened by the pandemic. Of course, now it's happening within the nation in heightened ways as well. However, aside from governments and intelligence agencies, refugees are also carefully monitoring borders, looking for safe passage or following established routes. I want to direct you to this project by the artist Heath Bunting. The project is called Border Crossing, and it details ways to cross international borders throughout Europe without legal documentation. It provides video, photography, maps, and necessary materials on this project website. It demonstrates how to succeed without being located by dogs and when not to run to avoid being shot. There is even a supplemental botanical guide so that you can avoid poisonous plants. Anyway, the majority of government mappings of border crossings are not made available to the public. They are kept under tight security. Why is this, do we think? Well, as we have moved into an era of digital surveillance, these maps, both government authorised and things like border crossing, are updated in real time, and they are being watched closely by two very divergent groups, those trying to get in and those trying to keep others out. Aside from this, there are other people that are playing with the concept of borders and really highlighting how abstract this line in the sand is. So take this example of a seesaw that popped up on the US-Mexico border, which I'm showing on the current slide. The architects of this project, Ronald Rael and Virginia Sanfratello, offered this piece as a reflection on the relationship between the two countries. Rather than seeing them as two separate, bounded entities, they were highlighting that if you do something on one side, it will have an impact on the other side. According to Rael, this is precisely what happens politically between the United States and Mexico. What they do there impacts here. What they do here will impact there, the same as a seesaw. On the cover of your tutorial workbooks this week, you would have seen an interesting image of what looks like a man laying in a hammock. This is an art piece by Murat Gök in Turkey called Border Hammock, where he has repurposed a part of the border fence as a hammock, disrupting the anxiety we often have around border crossings by using it as an object we often associate with relaxation. Of course, the mapping of border flows has provided us with really interesting information about people on the move through this time of the pandemic. For example, we know that India, who has the highest number of international migrants in the world, experienced the return of more than 60,000 migrant workers until they restricted international travel on the 22nd of March. We also know about internal movement. Again, in India, 3 million Indian internal migrants returned from major cities to their home states through the pandemic. We know that tens of thousands of Ukrainians working abroad returned home as businesses closed and economies slowed down. We also know that hundreds of Venezuelans in Colombia returned from exile because they were losing their financial lifeline. And this is something that's really interesting to consider when we look at the UNHCR report, which was our third reading for this week, which has a lot of detail about Venezuelan refugees. We also know that thousands of jobless migrant workers in Thailand travelled back to Cambodia and Laos, both from official and unofficial crossing points. And we know that over 14,000 migrants from Mozambique who were working in the mining sector returned from South Africa, all in the space of a few days as South Africa declared lockdown. It's interesting to think what the global pandemic has done in relation to these macrostructural and microagentic and also complexity theories of migration. How do these theories of migration play out in the pandemic? Where do we see each of these being applicable and to which groups? And I'll leave this as a suggestion of something that you might want to explore with each other in tutorials. And I'm sure that a lot of you will have personal stories that are applicable here as well. So to recap, in the 21st century, more people are on the move than ever before. They are moving in a more dynamic manner than in the past, and they're heading in multiple directions. They do not always move with the intention of settling, and this is making attempts to map and govern the movement of people difficult. Connections and relations are increasingly formed across cultural boundaries and through dispersed networks. Similarly, the kinds of people on the move across the world also defy the stereotypes of migrants as either desperate or dangerous. As the scale, diversity, and complexity of mobility has increased, the capacity to regulate and control it has decreased. For a long period of time, the traditional identity of those on the move was defined partly by place. However, identity is no longer rooted in place, but dispersed across multiple places and spread across different time zones. The impact of mobility on identity and culture is most profound at the border zones, where inequalities, persecutions, and the need to escape are at their most extreme. Well, we've unpacked a lot of material today, so hopefully you're now able to take a step back from your computer, have a little bit of a rest, let it kind of sit and settle in your brain. I hope that you have a wonderful second week of semester, and I look forward to seeing you in tutorials. Have a great week.